All right, welcome to Sunday School. We are going to pick up today with Exodus 13. And if you remember, we had the institution of Passover. We had the we discussed a little bit the unleavened bread versus Passover and kind of those two different motifs in the same holiday. And then we were ready to leave, and it feels like they're leaving, but what we start with today, it's like we're getting a little bit retelling they're about to leave. And so again, we're used to this from reading Hebrew narrative. We're going to have a level of redundancy, which was more pleasing to them than it often is to modern Western hearers. But let's jump in with the 13th chapter. And can everyone see the text? Showing up? All right. The Lord said to Moses, consecrate me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine. All right, now hold on to this because we're going to come back to this. But it's this idea that the firstborn of anything belongs to the Lord. And this goes beyond animals and people. We often hear in an agricultural setting, like ancient Israel was, we hear about the first fruits, right? The first of the harvest is the Lord. So this idea that the first that comes in is the Lord. So we just get this quick statement, but this is going to get picked back up later in this chapter. So Moses said to the people, remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. It shall serve for you as a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. For with a strong hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. You shall keep this ordinance at its proper time from year to year. So again, we get a retelling of the festival of unleavened bread, but without the idea of you're eating unleavened bread because we're in a hurry. This is just because this is what we do and this is why we do it. But notice in verse 9, and this is going to come up in this chapter in another context, shall for you as a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead, so that the teaching of the Lord may be on your lips. Now, this is a symbolic comment at this point, where it's basically saying this shall be something that's on your hand, between your eyes, like so it's ever on your mind. We even today use the expression that it's at hand, this idea that it should be a reminder. So it's at your hand and it's at your forehead. This is going to be used a number of times. We'll see it twice in this chapter. But when we get the Shema, you know, the famous Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. As we go through that passage, there's the statement, you shall bind these things to your hand and to your forehead. And these are what in Judaism are called the phylacteries. So if you ever see religious Jews, they take this very literally. So when like Hasidic Jews pray, they will take out two things, and it's like a little box that they wrap a leather strap around their arm, And then they take a box that they put on their forehead and they tie that around their head. And they are taking literally the language of, you shall bind these to your hand and between your eyes. But it's the idea of a constant memorial, a constant reminder, a constant memory. And we get the same thing here, that this festival of unleavened bread will be on your hand between your eyes. Keep it in mind, keep it at hand. But this is what is literally done by the most religious Jews when they pray. And in the same passage is where we get the mezuzah, which is the little box that sits on a doorpost of Jewish buildings and rooms. Because it says, and you shall write these things on your doorposts and on the gates of your houses and cities. And so this is taking literally the passage, which is actually in Deuteronomy. But think about how this comes up again in Scripture. Remember when we studied, it's actually a year ago exactly now, when we studied the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation, when the Antichrist comes, right? We talked about the unholy Trinity. To receive the mark of the beast was to get a sign on your hand or on your forehead. It was taking everything that God does and it does it the opposite or for a different purpose. And so this is the same theme. So anyway, the festival of unleavened bread will be like a sign on your head and on your hand. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so they're going to keep this every year, and all of these holidays are to be reminders of what God did. So now here comes the consecration of the firstborn. When the Lord,
I did have one question, maybe since it looks like we're leaving the Festival of Unleavened Bread at this point. Two quick questions. First, is the Festival of Unleavened Bread different from the Passover?
At one point, scholars think it might have been that the two of them elide into one, but now they become the same names for different names for the same festival. So now Passover is called the Festival of Unleavened Bread as well.
Okay.
But
so
the second question. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
No, I say, but it seems like at one point it might have been two separate things that kind of elide into one, kind of like how in our modern, and again, this is extending this concept, but in some ways, think about how in Christianity you have a St. Nicholas Day at the beginning of December.
Right.
And then you have Christmas, but somehow St. Nick turns into Santa Claus, which all melds into one day. It may be similar to that.
Okay. So the other question is, from what I understand about the, I guess you'd call it the liturgy of the Seder, that is not spelled out in the scriptures. So it's the modern day Seder meal, kind of based on tradition, because a lot of Christians, I think, read into that, a lot of imagery about the coming of Jesus and the hiding of the, part of the bread and so forth. But that's, do I understand that that's not in the Old Testament scriptures, that's tradition?
Correct. It comes from, all of those traditions get built out of rabbinic literature. So you have the Old Testament, and then the Old Testament gets explained and developed in theology, like what it all is supposed to mean for Judaism in the rabbinic writings, like the Mishnah, the Talmud, the different halakha, the different religious writings about how to live. And those traditions are part of, they're still oral, but some of those things would have been in the minds of the people during the time of Jesus. So they're keeping a Passover. And then Christianity, as it does things like Christianizing the Seder and explaining it in that lens, is like then building Christian theology on the Jewish theology on the Passover, which was like, for me, that was one of the most significant things about studying at Hebrew Union College, because for me, Judaism was the Old Testament. And what I found out was Judaism Judaism is the Talmud, and it's the Talmud's way of reading the New Testament. I mean, reading the Old Testament. So it's a fleshing out. So there's this thing where, as a Christian, I would say, well, how do Jews not read the Old Testament and see all these things that point to Jesus? But I had to come to understand that I was, like good Luther language, I was reading Old Testament like through the lens of the manger, right? Through the lens of gospel. Where Jews are reading the Old Testament through the lens of Talmud. And in the same way, Muslims are probably looking at us going, how do they not get that what they're saying about Jesus is blasphemy because Muhammad is the final prophet? Because they're reading Torah and Psalms and Gospel through the lens of Quran, Hadith, and the other writings of Muhammad and the Islamic sages. And so your question's a great one. It's not Hebrew Bible or Old Testament on its own. It's what become the other Jewish scriptures that flesh out what that means and how we understand it. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Thank you.
Good question. All right. Anybody else before we talk about firstborn? This is going to emphasize how important. Let me see something for a second. How many people here are firstborns? Show of hands. Okay. This is gonna be a big deal for you, so you have to pay attention to this. We're our firstborns. When the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your ancestors, and given it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your livestock that are males shall be the Lord's. But every firstborn donkey you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. Every firstborn male among your children you shall redeem. When in the future your child asks you, what does this mean? You shall answer, by strength of hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human firstborn to the firstborn of animals. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord every male that first opens the womb, but every firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall serve as a sign on your hand and as an emblem on your forehead, that by strength of hand the Lord brought us up out of Egypt. Okay, so in those days, you firstborn women would be off the hook, but in today's modern day, they would say, hey, you're right in there just as good as the boys. So if you were Reformed Jews, right, like this would, you'd be in as well. This notion that the firstborn belongs to the Lord as a sacrifice applies to the first grains come into the storehouse for the Lord. The first animals turn into a sacrifice to the Lord. But the idea of the humans, because again, ancient Israel does not want human sacrifice. They are going to redeem or buy back to themselves. And so an offering and sacrifices made on behalf of firstborn sons in order that they can go back to their families. There's a similar tradition in some areas of India as part of Hinduism, where the idea is every firstborn child is to be handed off to the temple. But what actually happens is there's a whole ritual as if you're bringing them to the temple, and then they work out this thing where you give a payment and then they end up giving you your child back. But symbolically, there's this idea that the first child is given over. This is like in the mindset of ancient Israel. It's like you're giving them over to the Lord, which instead of sacrificing them, becomes temple service. So remember the story with Samuel? where he's born and he's the firstborn and he's given over and he's raised by Eli. But again, the common practice becomes you redeem them, you buy them back. So remember, in Luke, we get the story how Mary and Joseph take baby Jesus to the temple and they make the offering for dedication. That's what this is talking about. It's about this idea that even, they're doing Jewish custom of the day and you have to redeem your child back. So this is an interesting idea because it's explained we do this to remind ourselves that God took all the firstborn. All right.
Dean,
Yes.
why did they single out donkeys for something different?
Oh, good question. Because donkeys are not kosher. So all the rest of the animals that are domesticated animals are kosher. And because you don't sacrifice non-kosher items, you trade out the donkey for a sheep. But it's like, if you're not going to do that, you have to kill it. There's this, if you go back to ancient sacrifice, and again, Israel doesn't look at it this way, but it doesn't mean it's not somewhere in the back of like the subconscious. Sacrifices are seen as food to gods, right? You don't offer things to gods you don't eat. So it's oils and it's wines and it's grains and it's lambs and it's goats and it's kosher birds. So you wouldn't offer a donkey. So you redeem it with a sheep instead. Great question.
Is a dog kosher?
No, but we don't. That's a good question. Dogs are not kosher. Kosher animals have to chew cud. But I never hear, except for you have some like slurs in the Bible that refer to dogs. And you have Caleb, the name Kelev is dog in Hebrew. But we don't hear about them like dogs on the farm or anything like that. Like they must have been there. That's a great question. Now you've got the thing I'm going to be looking at this week, trying to figure that out, why they don't talk about dogs. Again, in a herding culture, and dogs being one of the first animals to be domesticated, you would think we'd get more reference to that.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
That's interesting.
All right, that's
your take.
session where we figure out where the dogs are.
On if a family has, it's a little confusing when they talk about the firstborn male, what they really mean by that. So in a family where a daughter is born first and then a son, they're not talking about the first of the males to be born. It's only if the male opens the womb. So there'd be no consequences for a family with a daughter first and then a son. That son would not be in this same category then.
That is my understanding, yes, because it's the one who would be seen. It's interesting because on the one hand, that first son would still be the heir, but in light of this understanding, they're seen as different as far as firstborn goes. Yeah. This next little section is something we've heard since Sunday school as children, but until I traveled to Israel and listened to my guide Munzer talk about it and experienced it, I never appreciated it in the way he interpreted it. So it's preparing them as they're getting ready to go. And he says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The Israelites went up out of the land of Egypt, prepared for battle. And Moses took with them the bones of Joseph, who had required a solemn oath of the Israelites, saying, God will surely take notice of you, and you must carry my bones with you from here. They set out from Sukkot and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. But the thing that I heard when I was in Israel and walking around with a group of pilgrims in June, is that one of the fascinating things about being in the land, and much of it being desert, is that it gets unbelievably hot during the day, but still being desert can get quite cold at night. So you have these huge swings. And a good guide, when you're going to stand at a place and talk about it, will find a way to get you somehow in a little bit of shade so you're not standing in direct sun. And when you're in the middle of the day in Israel, it's amazing how like 30 people can crunch themselves together to be in the shade of one tree, because the difference in how it feels is remarkable. And my guide said, like, look, this isn't just, I always thought of it as just as a visual, right? You can see a cloud during the day and you can see fire at night. But he said, this is also a sign of the Lord's provision. So he envisions it as like this large pillar of cloud, which casts like one big shadow that everyone would be walking like in a tight formation to stay in the shade. And then at night, as it became cold, right, the pillar of fire would be a way to keep them. Again, one can't prove that, but it's like one of those nice, once you experience the land, you go, oh, yeah, that would actually make a lot of sense. Let me show you a picture that I want us to think about in this kind of route of the Exodus. Okay, I'm going to switch over. Tell me if you see the map. Map come up for you? Okay. Now, there's a couple things we have to talk about. The text references that they didn't go by way of the Philistines. Now, we all know the story that the Israelites are going to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. If you were to walk from Goshen, right? Here's where the Israelites were living, up in the Nile Delta. And you are going to come along the way of the sea, up through the land of the Philistines. See Gaza, which is again, the Philistines were kind of in what is now the Gaza Strip. If you were to go up that way, that's probably maybe an 11-day walk. It's not far, okay? It's a quick trip, but the way that the narrative explains it is Moses does not want to take the people who are just escaping ragtag group of slaves into direct battle with the Philistines, who caused problems throughout the region for generations. So instead, they're going to take the roundabout way through the Sinai Peninsula, up through what would now be Jordan, then was Edom and Moab, and then come up that way and cross over into the land. Okay, so there was a much faster way to go, but they didn't want to go right into battle. The other thing is that is a geography name situation. The Hebrew that talks about the body of water that the Israelites are going to encounter is the Yam Suf. Yam means sea. Suf means reed. The text reads the Sea of Reeds, but in tradition, an E has dropped out and has become the Red Sea. We don't know exactly where the Yam Suf was. You have different scholars trying to explain that, well, you know, you have the Red Sea, which becomes part of Suez Canal, right? Like they clear this out, but there's some body of water that gets crossed through here. But the Israelites do not come all the way down here to cross the major part of the Red Sea as we know it today. And this also is all part of the Red Sea. You have these two gulfs. The Red Sea goes all the way down. So where exactly the Israelites cross, that's been one of those great scholarly debates, even to the point of trying to, I knew one scholar who was trying to get footage from satellites to try to be able to see from above, to get understandings where ancient canals and waterways might have been, to try to figure out where the Reed Sea was. We don't really know, but you can see all different versions. If you even just go on Google and search route of the Exodus, there'll be all kinds of movements around here because it's somewhere in here, but there is not a fixed understanding of exactly where that is. The traditional Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb is down in the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula and is related to a monastery of St. Catherine, which is something you can visit as a tourist today. I have not had the fortune of doing that yet, but that is on my list of things I want to do soon. So get ready to sign up with me for a trip to go to Egypt, and we'll all go on Mount Sinai together. Again, in many of these things, these are traditional understandings of where things are. You can't prove them, but if nothing else, you get a great sense of landscape, geography, and what it could have looked like. All right.
Thank you.
Any questions about the map?
No, good.
One day we can do a whole modern Israeli history and talk about the whole Sinai Peninsula and all the things that went on there with the 6-Day War. But that's for another time. All right, let's move into chapter 14. Because this is all set up for where it's about to get good. All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back.
Right.
Can people see the text? Okay. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal Zephon. You shall camp opposite by the sea. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has closed in on them. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, so that I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. And they did so. All right, now think about this. Think about this theme that we've been talking about as we've read this, that this is a whole appearance versus reality, where Moses is asking for time off to worship, but that it's part of an elaborate deception to get his people, all his people, their goods, right? Their flocks and herds, and in the end, even the wealth of the Egyptians by asking to borrow the neighbor's finery, and that now they're going to take off. And it felt like, well, that's one good trick, right? You feel like you're watching Ocean's 11 or something, or The Italian Job, right? But the biggest, this isn't, so often we think it ends by, okay, well, they got out. We realize at this point, the actual intent is not just to get them free, but to win a battle against the army of the Egyptians. And how does a ragtag group of servants and slaves with no weapons or military training defeat a powerful army? He says, by camping in a place where it looks like you're confused and trapped in. So the Israelites intentionally camp in a place where it looks like they're stuck. They've got themselves trapped near the sea. So look what happens. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done letting Israel leave our service?" See, they're hearing they fled. Again, he gave them permission to go worship, and he said, "Hey, pray for me too." But now he realizes they're out of here. In this exact language, for those who were with us in the Genesis study, about when he realized they fled, is the same language we get around Jacob and Laban. When all of a sudden Laban realizes Jacob had fled, he goes after him in pursuit. What have we done, letting Israel leave our service? So he took his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. Remember, this is the final coup de grace in the kill the guy with the ball. He'd been setting him up all along, hardening his heart so he got to use all his plagues, but now the best one's coming. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. They overtook them, camped by the sea, by Pi-Hahirot and in front of Baal-Zephon. And again, to Keith's question a few weeks ago, notice it says all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots. But when this is all over, the guy's going to somehow have a way to ride back home, and it isn't like they wiped out all thoroughbreds from the land of Egypt. As the Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward, but you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground. Then I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And so I will gain glory for myself over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his chariot drivers. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his chariot drivers." The angel of God, who was going before the Israelite army, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. So again, you have this blocking the army away from the Israelite people. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at the dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Okay, there is so much to talk about right there. This is one of those passages I could do a whole 3-week series on, but I don't want to bore you with that level of detail because that's probably only interesting to me. So I'm gonna find a happy medium. But so one is just the power of this miracle that delivers the Israelites in their final escape from Egypt, right? So like on the most surface level of this account, the overall narrative is how is God going to hear the cries of his people and rescue them from Egypt? And this is like the grand finale, right? This is the rescue because the plagues punished Egypt, drew them to a point where the Pharaoh would let them go. They make their way out of town. God hardens his heart one more time so that they come after him. And this is the way an armyless, weaponless people can defeat the Egyptian army. And it's the beginning of this major motif that Yahweh is a warrior and he fights on behalf of his people. And he does it in ways that show his power and strength, and that it never is because of the strength of the people. And if you think about the rest of the story of ancient Israel, right, this is the line that we get in the prophets about not by power, not by might, but by my spirit, says the Lord, right? In every one of the battles in the book of Judges, they're always outnumbered, outgunned, outmanned, but it doesn't matter. They win because God's on their side. We look at the conquest narratives. How did these people defeat a place like Jericho, right? It's the miraculous power of God. How does Gideon defeat all these people where God keeps shrinking his fighting band? It's to make the point, Yahweh wins the battle. And how do we know he's that kind of deity? Well, it starts out with the Exodus. So strangely, when the tiny little boy is about to go up against Goliath, we shouldn't even have a second thought about it because we're like, that's the way he does it. Okay. And so that's one thing. This is God's deliverance of his people, which is the beginning of God constantly delivering his people. Okay. Thing two, and for people who have been studying with me for a while, we have done in the past a study of creation in the Bible and in the ancient Near East. And there is a common motif in the ancient Near East that creation stories often come out of conflict narratives. And the conflict narratives are often in the Enuma Elish, and even in a narrative about Baal in the Canaanite mythology is about the battle with the sea. And in Israelite prophets and in the Psalms, we get all this language about how Yahweh battles the sea. He battles the water. He battles Leviathan. He battles Tananim. He battles sea creatures. Because in ancient mythology, this is a normal mythic construct that the deities fight sea monsters. And in the Enuma Elish, and this is where I wish I had my big whiteboard behind me. In the Enuma Elish, when the gods get so mad, they want to, the mother and father deities want to kill all their children. Remember, they fight back against them. And it is Marduk who does battle with his mother, Tiamat, the sea monster. And when he kills her, he takes her body, She's watery chaos, and he slices her in two so that her bottom part of the body becomes the ground and the upper part of her body becomes the sky. That's why when you drill down into the earth, water comes up, and why the sky is blue and rain and waters come down. And the peoples lived between the upper half of her body and the bottom half of her body. That was the creation of the Babylonian world. And when we look at Genesis 1, what do we begin with? We begin with watery chaos. And in verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, right? The world was formless and void, and the wind or the spirit was moving over the waters. People are just, wait, where did the waters come from? That's the way ancient Near Eastern creation stories start. There's watery chaos. But what does God do? He divides the waters above, and he calls that the firmament or the sky, and he puts the waters below, and then he divides the waters below to sea and dry land. But creation stories are constantly telling us about dividing watery chaos. Okay? Think about that as a metaphor for what just happened in this story. This isn't just, on one level, yes, it's a story about freeing Israel and destroying the Egyptians. On another level, this is using ancient Near Eastern creation motifs because God is creating a people, his nation, Israel, and freeing them from the Egyptians. He is establishing his leader, Moses. This is a kind of creation narrative of the people of Israel who have now left their enemies, have left servitude and bondage, and they are now being created into the nation of Israel. Okay? So you have one level of this story. It's the story of freedom and a good trickster story of how do you beat Egyptians. You have another layer where it's a creation motif, so that when you read through the Psalms now, when you read through Isaiah and you hear these things, Yahweh in days of old, when you battled sea, when you took on the sea monster, when you look at Habakkuk chapters 1 and 2, it's all the stuff about battling seas and the waters and the rivers. It's like taking that and saying, and here's the historical phenomenon that embodies that ancient mythic motif. He divided the sea to create his people.
Hmm.
Next level.
Wow.
Remember in Genesis, when Abraham, still Abram, is promised, you will be a great name, a great nation, and I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, but he doesn't think he's ever going to have children of his own. So he's going to make Eliezer his slave to become his heir. And God says, no, it will be from your body. And remember where he tells him to cut in half the oxen and to cut the birds and leave the parts on the ground. And then that flaming cauldron, which was the symbol of the Lord, passes between it. And we said that is covenant symbolism, because we say, hey, let's shake hands on it. In ancient Israel, when you made a covenant, you would cut animals in half and you would walk between the parts as if to say, may it be to either one of us if we break this covenant, right? That's the danger threat in any oath. Cross my heart, hope to die, stick a needle in my eye, right? We say that from the time we're kids. If I break this promise, let this bad thing happen to me. In Genesis 15, that is not a sacrifice. It's a covenant oath. And notice, Abraham does not pass between the part. Only God does, because it is a covenant that is unconditional. There's no threat on the people. God just makes the promise, this threat is on me alone. He walks between the parts. This is covenant imagery in the crossing of the sea. Because if you think of ancient Israelite worldview, and in this kind of language where the sea is a being that is being divided in two, Israel is walking between the parts. It is ratifying a covenant between itself and Yahweh. And so this simple little story that we hear from the time we're children, and all it means is, ha ha ha, we got away and we killed the Egyptians. Yes, that's one level of this story. But for the sophisticated ancient Israelite who knew the stories and myths and legends of their day, they hear this and they say, this is a creation story. They hear this and they say, this is a covenant sealing act because the peoples pass through the parts. So in light of all that, in light of all those layers, think about how this ends. Thus, the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, believed in the Lord, and in his servant Moses. And in this great act of the Exodus, we have the foundation for the story of God's people, because it's his deliverance. It's his creating them into a people. It's his covenant building with them, which will get picked up on over and over. It's why the exile later will be seen as Exodus narrative again, because they are brought back. And in that famous passage in Isaiah 40, where it talks about he will split the wilderness because he will create a pathway through the wilderness, it's an image of Exodus. When Gospel of John talks about Jesus, it is using Exodus language about he is redeeming them and bringing them out. When we read the Gospels and we hear the story, even before Gospels, let me back up. When the Israelites go into the land of land of Israel, it's the dividing of the Jordan River. So they walk on dry land. It's the same image again.
Mhm.
It's the same thing that happens when it establishes Elijah and Elisha as the prophets of Israel. They cross the river by dividing it. But then taking it to the next level, when the disciples are in the boat and they are afraid of the sea and all it represents, it's Jesus who doesn't divide the sea.
Mm.
He literally walks across the top of it. It's Jesus who calms the sea. And they say, who is this that the wind and sea obey him? These themes and motifs that come out of the story of Exodus are the ones that are always working their way into the Bible story. And I will just share this freely. My favorite moment, one of my favorite moments, I have lots of favorite moments, but one of my favorite moments when we are in the Holy Land together is when we get to do a devotional out on a boat, out on the Sea of Galilee,
Yeah.
Jesus calming the sea. And as much as I can to try to bring all this to
Yeah.
bear to say, this is a story of creation, and it's a story of destruction of enemies and about exodus and freedom and liberation, and of Jesus who controls all of nature and makes things
Mm.
for fearful disciples who are worried that their end is near. And Jesus still sleeps in the boat like nothing's going on. This Exodus passage carries so much weight that I want us to read one more thing. And I want to read it like I think it's intended. I don't want to dissect it all. But they come through this, and we then get chapter 15, which is a song. And in many ways, the song probably, well, if the song is sung, the song exists before the narrative, and you have these ancient songs and these ancient poems that narrative surrounds. But it's like any musical, we've said this before, right? When you're in the musical and a really big point comes, they break into song. It's the same in the Bible. And the songs tell the stories, and then the stories form around the songs. So you had a Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer song before they made the claymation show to fit the song. And so I think in many of these things we build backwards, right? You had a Frosty song and then you made the cartoon. Probably before there was an Exodus narrative,
Yeah.
had the song of Moses that was sung among the people. Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he is thrown into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and my might. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariot and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the reed sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Yahweh, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Yahweh, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake. I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword. My hand shall destroy them. You blew your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand. The earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love, you let the people whom you redeemed. You guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples heard, they trembled. Pangs seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom were dismayed. Trembling seized the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them. By the might of your arm, they became still as a stone, until your people, O Yahweh, passed by, until the people whom you acquired passed by. You brought them in and planted them on the mountain of your possession, the place, O Yahweh, that you made your abode, the sanctuary, O Yahweh, that your hands have established. Yahweh will reign forever and ever. When Pharaoh with his chariots and his chariot drivers went into the sea, the Lord brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then the prophet Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with her after tambourines and with dancing. And Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea. And if you've done Seders, you know that you sing that. You sing about horse and rider thrown into the sea. For this is the victory of Yahweh the warrior, Yahweh the creator, Yahweh the redeemer. Amen. Thoughts, questions?
I think this was the first time that I thought of this story as a narrative about Yahweh rather than a narrative about Moses and Pharaoh. I always perceive that as being the human element and not necessarily the how God hardens his heart and that kind of thing, how it's really God's decision. God's, he's really in charge.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I just never thought of it in that context before. And and the other thing about those songs, Nancy, is I can hear a lot of that who is like the Lord? There is no one.
Yes.
Who is like the Lord? He is, yeah, strong and mighty. That goes through my head.
Yep.
It's that a lot of them come through. It's amazing.
These ancient songs of praise get reused,
Mhm.
reformed, and recycled and re-liturgized throughout Jewish and Christian worship. And Nancy, you make a great point, because one of the things, and I never thought about this way, I was in college and there was a professor at Wheaton, Dr. Reichen, whose son actually now is the president at Wheaton. But Dr. Reichen wrote a book about the Bible as literature. And in it, he makes this point that you realize ultimately is obvious, but you don't think about it that way, is he's like, the main character of the Bible is God.
Mhm.
God narrative. We make it a people narrative where God shows up, but it's really the story of God and how God creates, redeems, and relates to his people. Yeah, good point. Any other
Yeah.
comments? So here's the thing. When we think of all these themes and motifs, keep holding these in your head, because when we get to the later commentary and history of interpretation as it works its way through movies, we will see, do the movie makers have any of these things working in the background? Are they pulling them in, or are they unaware? We'll have to decide. We see their
Okay. That's good.
yeah, because some of the things you'll realize, like, oh, they are aware of some of these things. They're more sophisticated sometimes than we realize.
Yeah.
Hey, Dean, what's the name of that mythological son who killed his mother that you were talking about? The one who halved her body and it went up and it went down.
Yeah, it's the title of it are the first two words of it. It's a cuneiform story. It's called Enuma, Enuma, new word, Elish, Elish.
Hmm.
Okay.
And there are so many interesting connections between that story. So it's about it's Apsu and Tiamat are the father and mother, and Marduk is the god who wins the day, and he's the god who's the patron deity of Babylon. So it's a creation story, but it's also the story of how Babylon ascends to the top of the pantheon in power. And it was part of the New Year's festival in ancient Babylon. They would read that story aloud. So it was the enthronement of the king, the elevation of Marduk, and it was the creation of the world all at once.
Mm.
So, yeah, we can go back sometime once we get done with this, and we can look at the Enuma Elish in Genesis 1, because I think there's a lot of parallels in those. Parallels meaning I think the writer of Genesis 1 is aware of this narrative, and he's almost parodying aspects of it.
Hmm.
So, anything else?
I don't know if anyone's watched the series The Chosen. It's a TV series about Jesus, about really taken much from the Gospel of John, and they just started season 2. We've enjoyed it quite a bit, and what's particularly interesting about this first episode of season 2 is it kind of fast forwards to the day when the Apostle John is sitting down to interview Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other apostles and eyewitnesses, kind of putting together his gospel and how he comes up with how he begins it. In the beginning was the Word. And it's a very of course, it's, a lot of literary license there, artistic license taken, but it's still a fascinating treatment of how John came up with this. I kind of get this sense as you talk about the influence of the ancient Near Eastern culture and traditions and myths and so forth. I just thought about how John's kind of dealing in that same world,
Exactly
and
right.
how he begins his gospel, echoing back to the creation story.
Yeah. I have to look at that. I've heard great things about it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's good.
That's what I've heard.
Very good.
It's
I kept
really
seeing
good.
commercials for it, but I haven't
Mm,
actually seen it yet.
It makes you cry.
All right.
What,
I have to see
what
it.
platform is it on? What platform?
It's the easiest way, you get an app for it, the Chosen app, and then you can, using that app, you can stream it to pretty much anything on your TV. But I think right now you can actually get it on YouTube.
Is it
So,
not Netflix or one of those? It's-
no, not Netflix. It's either directly through the Chosen app or and they do allow these to be on YouTube for a time. They're not always up, but I think right now you can see the first season and the beginning of the second on YouTube.
Thanks.
Okay. Great.
Highly recommended.
Mhm.
That's good. All right, let me close this in prayer. God, we thank you for this day, for power of Easter and the power of resurrection inside each one of us. We thank you for this account of the crossing of the sea. I pray, God, as we wrestle with all the implications of this narrative, that we understand how you are the one who continually sets your people free, that you are the one who creates in us and through us and makes us a people. God, may we be aware of all the ways that you are bringing all things together. God, I pray this day that as we go out, that we are your light and that we are your example in all we do and in all we say. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All
Thank
right,
you.
everyone. Remember, we will not have class next week, but then we'll pick up in a couple weeks with chapter 16.
All right, bye. Blessings. Thank you.
See you, everyone.
Have a
Thanks,
safe
Dean.
trip.
Dean, tell Jake we enjoyed seeing him.
I will.
Yeah.
Glad to be home.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Yeah, it was great.